farmers, mountain back to Atlantic Ocean, Obomi Hills to Pocondre, to educate, elevate, and promote. Yeah, focus on Liberia, for Liberia, Liberia, for Liberia, yeah. From Monday to Sunday, from Monday to Sunday, it's focus on Liberia. Talk about home affairs, eh, in diaspora, current affairs, reliable information, history, talking about culture, politics, education, entertainment, business, sports, advertisement, articulation. Focus on Liberia. Focus on Liberia. Focus on Liberia. From Monday to Sunday. Focus on.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another session of Focus on Liberia on the Marketplace. I am your host, Gabriel Carter. On a Saturday afternoon, it's good to be here. For those of you watching from wherever you are, this is going to be a brief session in terms of our normal shows that we usually do here at 3 o'clock. Today, we're going to be talking about the arrest agenda for inclusive development, which is the current policy framework that was put out by the current administration. We're going to start a series on here on Focus on Liberia on the Marketplace. And that series, what it's going to do is look at the policy within its entirety. I think I said it on previous shows, it is about 300 pages. There's a lot that is in it. A lot of initiatives that this government is looking to undertake within the next 5 years to 2029. Hopefully, it goes beyond that. So what we want to do today is just an introduction to this series, what it is, which is solely going to be focused on the AID agenda as it's commonly known. There are a lot of pillars within that agenda. One of it is actually the governance and anti-corruption pillars, right? Which looks at good governance and anti-corruption. I think we can take that with a grain of salt, and the reason why I say we can take that with a grain of salt is because unless you've been living under the rock, if you're from Liberia, what has been happening in our country does not resemble any form of an agenda that is looking to fight corruption. So maybe hopefully with the introduction of this policy or agenda, hopefully they can pivot towards fighting corruption. The reason why I said that because there is the central bank audit that implicated a lot of people. Nobody was held accountable. There's the LACC audit as well that implicated a lot of people. And there are a lot of cases of corruption that this administration has not done anything about. So to put in a policy framework that there's a whole pillar in specifically towards that, that's what I said. Take it with a grain of salt. Whatever you're going to do with that is up to you. We're going to unpack it, and whatever you take away from it, that is up to you. There's another pillar of environmental sustainability. It talks about how to leverage the natural resources in our country, but at the same time also looking at the environmental aspect of that comes along with that. As I usually like to tell people, even if we have resources as massive as Saudi Arabia, These are not resources we're going, natural resources we're going to have in perpetuity. These things are depleted. And as such, you have to think about how to pivot away from that, how to diversify away from being dependent on natural resources. So there's a pillar in that aid agenda that focuses on that. There's also the rule of law, which looks at strengthening the framework of the legal system in our country. As those of you who don't know, that for us, I can say it is broken. The legal framework in our country is broken. Even the Supreme Court um, trying to really interject itself in the current House of Representative debacle. Nobody's is yielding to it. So we have a democracy that is what I like to refer to as it is in a quagmire. Uh, the Supreme Court says something else. The government is doing something completely different. It's circumventing what the Supreme Court says. So technically, you don't have a rule of law in our country. So again, to look at all of that, to say you're putting something into policy, and that was deliberate. The fact that we circumvented the decision of the Supreme Court, which it is the body, the arch body of rule of law in the country, to circumvent that and go against what they say. But at the same time, you have a policy item to say that you want to strengthen the rule of law in the country. It's I want to see how that plays out. There is another pillar to that, which is the human capital development. As those of you know, I was just having a conversation with someone, and we were just having a discussion about that in terms of the skill gap in Liberia compared to our peers in the other countries. Uh, there is a massive skill gap, and I say this all the time, not to beat on people who works in the government. Most people who leave work in government and come to the US trying to work, they usually have a hard time finding a job. And that is because the government is not really doesn't teach you. There's not a place you hone a skill set to develop a skill set. There's not in terms of those technical skills that people talk about that you need to work in any part of the world. It's not there. But in its entirety, in the country itself, that is because of our current education system, there is a massive skill gap there that it is you know evidence in everything you do, even in conversation. The level of conversation, it is evidence in everything, right? So that pillar, which is the human capital development, looks at uh, advancing education, healthcare, empowerment of women and people with disability in every sector of the economy. But it also looks at um, pretty much how to in its entirety, how to develop our uh, uh, human capital uh, sector, right? Finally, and not maybe I could be missing something else here, but the other aspect of it is the infrastructure pillar, which looks is basically, as I said, it wants to look at infrastructure in terms of how to build roads, networks, either hard or soft infrastructures. We're looking at roads and bridges. One of the things in this agenda that they talk about is they want to pick up from where the PAPD left off, meaning where the previous administration, meaning so that's another positive. That's a positive aspect of this agenda, meaning it's trying to continue things in perpetuity, right? Continuity is the word, right? Continuity of development instead of, this person started something that they were doing, and then I come in and go left and try doing something completely different, instead of picking up where that person left off to continue the process with it. Now, my favorite part of this whole agenda, and this is where the reality comes in, and this is what we do on this show, which is the finance and economic piece of it. We talk everything on this show is about finance, economic, and business, right? So my favorite part of this show, I mean, this piece of the agenda is the financing piece. That policy, that agenda was tagged for 8.3, let's say 8.4, 8.38 billion. So technically 8.4 billion in terms of to finance it within uh, 5 years. right? That's the time frame that was given, and that was, if you've done projections, you've done modeling. One of the biggest thing that is done in modeling, whether it's financial modeling or projection, is that it relies on a lot of projections. Projections meaning you take what has happened in the previous either 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and then you look at that and grow it by certain uh, basis point or a certain percentage to come up with your future projections. So this agenda as well makes a lot of projection, right? It takes a lot of projection into accountability. It takes a lot of factors into accountability to look at this whole um, agenda in terms of how they're going to fund it, right? This is so if you look at the financing piece of it, they talk about the economic transformation piece of it, right? Which is going to cost, according to the agenda, 1.5 billion, right? 1.6, technically 1.59 billion, right? So 1.6 billion, right? The infrastructure, which is another pillar, will cost about 2.5 billion. The rule of law, 600 million. Anti-corruption, 800 million. Human capital, 2.5 in its entirety. And so that is the financing piece of it. Now, if you have funding, you have to uh, talk about where the source of funding, right? So the source of funding here is, and this is something, as I said, as we talk about this series, we will unpack every aspect of it. But to break this down to you, the source of funding, they're projecting that the government will fund 2.5 billion of it, which is about 30%. The private sector will fund another 35%, which is uh, 2.7 billion. The government is relying on grants and other international partners, but technically the grant aspect of it will be 1.9 billion, which is about 25 billion. And excuse me, there's a 700 million uh, part of it, which is from the diaspora, which is about 10% of it. So what we're going to do doing throughout this series, we're going to be unpacking it, meaning how realistic, and this is one thing you will understand, that when you're doing projection, you're putting out reports like these or a policy, you don't want it to just be aspiration. You also want it to be realistic in terms of, yes, there's a lot of aspiration, but how realistic is it given the prevailing economic conditions in the country or regionally or even globally that will impact this aspirational plan that you put out? So you have to factor in those things as well. And that will actually help you uh, come to an average projection model that is a bit more aspirational, but a little bit more realistic in terms of achieving that, right? Uh, to achieve that, we talk about also the implementation. Once you get all this funding together in terms of the 8.4 billion, what, how are you going to implement it, right? In their case, to their, if you look in the model, I mean, the agenda, they talk about government sector working group. They also have a monitoring and evaluation group that is going to be doing the monitoring, right? So that is the series that we're going to be doing on this show. And for us, as I said, it's probably going to take, because this is a 300-page document. Um, so we're going to be peeling it back. Either we're going to do it by pillar, or we're going to be doing it sector by sector. But I think the a realistic approach will be doing it pillar by pillar and see how that fits into everything, right? So let's go back to the one of the pillars here, which is the governance and anti-corruption. And as I said earlier, you can take that with a grain of salt, meaning it's as I said, to be honest with you, I think I like the agenda itself, meaning the fact that it was written, it was put on paper, uh, regardless of how aspirational it may be, you have something which is like a blueprint you can go back to that keeps you honest. It keeps you honest, right? It holds you accountable. So that means if you're pivoting away from it, you're doing things a way that is deviating from it, you can always go back to it and say, hey, we decided, we planned, we projected that we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we need to go back on track to do what we said we're going to do. So that's the reason why I like this plan. It is on paper. People can refer to it. It can hold. We can. All of us here can hold the government accountable in terms of what they said they're going to do, how they said they're going to do it, and even the allocation of capital that is going to be injected into it, how they said they're going to uh, deploy that capital and carry out exactly what they wanted to do. So let's talk about the anti-corruption piece of it. And I'm going to be brief on these issues because, as I said, we're going to be unpacking them in more detail. Uh, the governance and anti-corruption piece of it. The reason why I said earlier you should take this with a grain of salt is because of what we have right now as a country over the last 12 months, right? I am no political expert here. My field is finance and economics. So that's the piece I have, but I do follow the political aspect of it that is playing out in the country. If you're not aware, we have a country right now where there is technically two speakership, right? We have Kofa and we have Kun. The uh, Supreme Court came out and technically in its ruling cited that we should go back to the technically going back with Kofa. However, the president circumvented that process and in his I mean you can say this was intentional in terms of what he was doing and sided with Kofa, I mean with Kuhn. So technically right now we have Kuhn as a speaker and we have Kofa as a speaker as well. So technically we have two speakers. Regardless of the outcome of the Supreme Court, we did not yield or did not heed to the decision that the Supreme Court made to say, okay, this is the 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 governing body of this country here. Let's follow exactly what they said because they were going by the Constitution. Let's follow them. That did not happen. So we have a democracy that is in a confused state of process right now. Yet under that confused that circumstances, we were able to pass a budget, and we somehow, some way, somehow, were blindly convincing ourselves that everything is running normally. This is not the case, right? So we have a democracy that is in a crisis, if you want to call it that. Someone somewhere have to come out and solve that problem. So when I saw this anti-corruption and the amount of money that they want to allocate to that, which is 600 million, the question that comes to mind is, what would that 600 million do if you cannot follow the basic rule, your constitution? What if let's look at it as somebody as an investor here. You see a company that is struggling that cannot follow its own basic principles, but it's asking you to inject 600 million into it so it can solve that problem. You know, why would somebody want to put that amount of money into the rule of law when the basic things you have, the basic tenets, which is your own governing body, which is the Supreme Court, it is telling you to do something and you're not following it through, right? That is the first thing. So the allocation of that 600 million, the question becomes, what are you going to do with that 600 million? What system, what institution are you going to build or that you're going to solve that all of a sudden going to allow you to follow the rule of law or establish a rule of law structure or within the country or even in every area of the economy? The other thing is that the corruption piece, right? If you have an anti-corruption pillar that you basically embedded into your agenda. However, you have this is not just the CBL report or the LECC report. There are different audits, corruption that implicate people into corruption, institution into corruption. As somebody who is very focused on fighting corruption, the first thing you would have done is set an example, especially those who were blatantly implicated, like the central bank governor, in terms of his gross negligence of how he ran the central bank and using the NSA as a slush fund, lending to institutions that are not financial institutions lending to private citizens that he shouldn't have lent to. That is a gross disregard of his role, right? So those are people you're supposed to make example out of. That will allow people to see that this administration is very serious about corruption, and that would have instead validated your push that you want to fight corruption, your anti-corruption pillar in this document. But again, as I said, I don't want to get too much in detail in that. So for me, those are the questions that comes to mind when I look through these different pillars. The environmental aspect of it, sustainability, as I said, we have to think about this. And even the great nation of Saudi Arabia that has over $2 trillion in oil, right, is pivoting away from oil, its dependency on oil. The environmental sustainability talk about leveraging the natural resources, how to maximize the natural resources. But I think what should be we should be focusing on instead is how to pivot away from being dependent on natural resources, whether it's iron ore, gold, and all these other uh, commodities that are being discovered in there. Yes, it's true, but do not make that a focus of a development agenda. Do not rely upon that in terms of the future of the country, because these things, especially a country as small as ours, are not plentiful. They're not plentiful. Eventually, they're going to deplete. And as these resources are mined, there's an environmental impact on that, on our country. We saw what is, was done to Yekepa and Mount Nimba and the Blue Lake that is still there today because we did not think about those environmental impact, and those things are still there. So as we leverage, these natural resources and how we're going to harvest and mine them and leverage them, we also have to think about the the environmental impact they're going to leave on our society, but also most importantly, how do we get away from them, right? Uh, the rule of law, in terms of strengthening the legal framework, I've already talked about that. It's a chicken and egg situation. Do you solve your rule of law um, before you get any funding, or do you use it? Do you wait for the funding before you solve your rule of law quagmire that you currently have in the House of Representatives? And what happens in the government translate to everything in the rest of the country. Meaning, if you are having such a hard time deciding how to solve legal issues in the House of Representatives. From those outside looking in, whether it's from an investor or even those that are in the diaspora that want to come and put money into the country, the first thing we're going to think about is if I business disputes happen all the time. If I have a business dispute, is this a country that has a legal system that is able to adjudicate that process smoothly, fast, without any corruption? Given what is happening in the House of Representatives, if they cannot solve that in their own government, what makes you think that same thing would translate into the private sector? That is the question that people will be asking. And as I said, as those of you that work in government, as you work in government, you have to think of your action as not just being uh, everything that happens in the government, but how it impacts everything else that happens in the country in its entirety. Meaning, what happens in the government, people seize it in the private sector and say, "Hey, this country is not serious for business." So we have to look at that aspect as well, right? So as I said, I don't know if this is chicken or egg. Are you waiting for the 600 million to solve your to strengthen your legal framework? And if you're giving that 600 million, let's say on the up case, you're able to raise it 8.4 billion and you're able to inject all this money into that, what are you going to do with each of these sectors to make sure that you deliver them, right? On the human capital side, as I said, there's I think for me, I think this would be probably it cannot be solved in five years, right? You might get the money, the 2.5 or 2.7 billion to inject into the education system, the healthcare, the empowerment of women, people with disability, but it will not solve the skill gap that exists in Liberia right now. I like to say this, and people like to, nail me to the cross for this every time I say it, but I stand by that. there's a level, and it's because I've talked to each group. There's a level of how do I want to call it, that you can see the level of education, the difference in level of education of those who graduated from LU before the war and those who did after the war. And I say this, I stand by it with every iota of breath within me. What the kind of education, the people, the talent we've been putting out isn't what is needed. They're not ready for the real world, what the rest of the world needs, right? They do not have the skill set that the real world needs. They do not have the grit that is needed to function in any private sector, right? So this is why I think even if we are able to raise that 2.5 billion to inject it into this, the amount of work that is needed to solve that skill gap in our education system would take decades. That means if we put our foot on the pedal, we have to keep it there for the next 20, 30, 40 years before we will start to see some gains in that area. The same thing with our healthcare, right? I cannot tell you the the amount of deaths that happened at JFK, the lack of even authentic, the basic, simple things, even at clinics, to have the, the right kind of medicine at those clinics is a problem. The same thing with JFK. You don't have quality medicines at those hospitals, equipment, doctors, you're not paying them. You know, this is why most doctors are leaving, right? So to have this money is not the question. The question is how do you implement, and I think that's one of the things they have in their agenda. How do you implement this process? How do you implement a system, even if you have to copy from another country? How do you do that to make sure you keep this thing going um, till you start seeing some gains in that area. The empowerment of women, I'm absolutely for that. I think women are disadvantaged in Liberia. Maybe I don't want to say then um, most country. I would say that most country. Um, so that the fact that we want to empower women, I think that is a good thing, but you have to be very intentional about that whole aspect as well. You cannot just be you cannot just be something you put in a policy, but you have to be intentional in terms of giving women opportunity in the government first of all, and hopefully that translate in the private sector as well in terms of making laws that protects women as well. So I think the human capital piece is something I'm very um, excited about in that policy, and I hope hopefully if when they're able to raise that money, they're really able to make some gains in that area. The last piece I want to talk about is the infrastructure. It's one of the most important part of it. When I say infrastructure, I think some people just think about roads, bridges, but you also have to think about soft infrastructure, meaning the networks, the cellular networks, our um, and every other thing that falls under that, right? So it's not just about roads and bridges, but the other networks like the cell communication networks and all of those things. And really making sure we have connectivity. The reason why I think this is also important as well, I think it lays the groundwork for us to be able to, when I mean us, Liberians, to be able to trade within ourselves within in that country. That means just because it's rain doesn't mean I should be disconnected from the people in the southeast, which is a whole region, right? So if you're able to have road networks that connect the entire country, meaning if someone is producing rice in Bong and they're selling it to Monrovia and the Monrovia market is saturated, they can bring that rice to it because there's a huge roads network. They're able to bring it to the southeast countries, I mean southeast counties, and be able to sell those in the southeast. Meaning, you are unlimited in terms of your market, what you can sell your goods. You're not just limited to just your county. If you you produce things here in whatever county, you're only limited to that market. You can travel to other counties to be able to sell this thing because you have a good road network, infrastructure network that allow you to do that. The other piece of this infrastructure, which is the the mobile money that connects our financial system, right? The infrastructure that behind that, the technology to be able to, have easy payment to, to be able to, pay for whatever goods you have, the financial infrastructure, right? So I think this agenda within itself, it's as I say, it's aspirational, but at the same time, what we have to do for those of us who are reviewing this is to make sure that we connect we connect the aspirational piece of it with the reality, meaning what is happening on the ground, the prevailing economic part of it, which is the next part that I want to get to, right? So in the that agenda, we have uh, they made, to their credit, they they made good assumptions in terms of from a growth perspective, which was the projection was 5.1%, was we achieved a 5.1% growth in 2024. This year we're expected to be at 5.8, and on average up to 2029, which is the end of their term, the average growth rate will be about 5.9%. Now, again, as I always like to say, these are projection, meaning if you do X, Y, and Z, you will get A, B, C, and D. Or if you do A, B, C, and D, you will get X, Y, and Z, meaning there are things you have to do from the macro side as well as the macro side to be able to achieve these numbers and figures. There are policy adjustment you have to make. There are policy framework you have to make, whether you have to look at your taxes. I think one of the other thing that was mentioned in there was the transition of even if it wasn't, I'm not sure if it was in here, but they just transition from GST to VAT, which is goods and services tax, to value added tax, which I think is a good thing, right? Again, it put us on par with the rest of the country in the region or on the continent, and it make us competitive from a tax advantage standpoint, right? However, if you work in a government, maybe they have a different tax rate, but I think it's the same tax rate from income tax. But I know people who works in the private sector. The tax rate in the private sector is 25%, right? So the problem there is you are charging corporation like tax, but penalizing income people who are working by allowing them to pay higher income tax rate. So it's counterintuitive, right, to having a VAT system that's supposed to make you competitive. Yes, it makes you competitive, more people can come in the country, but does it make your workers competitive, right? If that person who is working, let's say they're making $1,000 and you're charging them 250, you're taking 250 off their paycheck. If they can find that similar role in that region in another country where there's lower tax, income tax, they will rather go do that than work in your country. So in essence, in as much that you think you're being competitive from a tax advantage standpoint by having a value added tax that is, kind of, flat line technically, for a better description, like a better description, you are also penalizing those consumers who from an income tax standpoint. So it's not a fair level competition, So that is something I think hopefully they can rectify that mistake and maybe reduce or even make the income tax the same as the corporate tax if you want to do that, which I think is about 15%. And you guys can keep me honest here. So I think the economics of it for the value added tax makes sense, but the fact that you are charging consumer income tax that is 25%, I think is counterintuitive to being competitive. Um, so for me, I think overall the plan itself has a lot in it. Um, The last piece I will talk about here before I wrap up is the source of funding, right? The source of funding. I think this is something you guys have heard um, on different platforms, hopefully, of where how realistic it is. And I will do it piece by piece. As I said earlier, I think I highlighted these earlier. So 30% or 2.5 billion is government funded. Let's take that piece, for example. Again, uh, as I always like to say, you can make projections, but you got to be realistic with the prevailing economic activities. Let's take the 30%, which is 2.5, that will be funded by the government, and say within the 5 years, this government can come up with 2.5 billion. Let's be a little realistic about that. Currently, we have a budget that is about 800 million. About 80% or more goes to a recurring expenditure. You only allocate, I think, just 6% or less, or 12%, I think, 106 million to public sector investment. Um, there is no surpluses unless you have some kind of contract, you know, government contract, uh, negotiation with private investors to have extra money coming in. The question is, in as much that this is aspirational, how realistic that this government is able to raise 2.5 billion over the course of 5 years? That is one question. The other part is that we don't talk about, I think we kind of sweep that under the rug. You have a debt burden, you know. How are you going to raise this money? Is this going to be from a tax base, taxable income tax that you're collecting, or are you going to raise it through debt, right? And if you're raising it through debt by just borrowing the 2.5 billion, what you're going to do, you're going to take us to now a $5 billion debt burden. That will bring us to almost 80% or even 90% debt to GDP ratio. Currently, at 2.5 billion, which is our current debt load, we are paying 134 million just to service the interest on that debt. That is not principals included, meaning you're not paying on principal. That is just the interest on that debt. So if you tag on another 2.5 billion, you can double that 134 times two, right? It's two times that you're going to be using to service the debt. And that is again at the assuming the rate that you borrow that initial 2.5 will be the rate that you borrow the the other 2.5 billion, right? If not, the interest rate could be higher on that. So the question becomes, how do you fund, raise this 2.5 billion from the government? That's one aspect. Let's get to the other part. They also projected or stated that they're going to raise another 2.7 billion from the private sector. Now, I want to be a little bit liberal on this, right? Meaning there's a little bit of it's a little bit more realistic. Meaning, because there are companies in the country, such as the mining company, these other uh, multinational companies that are in the country that are exploring, like say XPX, whatever you want to call them, that are looking to do deals in Liberia. From those contract negotiation, that private sector is able to yield, you're able to yield that amount from them, via different negotiation. If you're very good at, if you're savvy, if you're a savvy, you have a very savvy group of negotiators, right? So that is, I think that is an easy target there that can be achieved in terms of raising that. Again, that is if you have uh, a very savvy group of negotiators. They are able to raise that amount from the multinational company and some of the development that are taking place in there. right? And I think the president alluded to some of that in his State of the Nation address. That there are some negotiations taking place um, that could hopefully um, you know contribute to this 2.7 billion that they're looking to raise. Here is something that I'm going to say on that, and I think this is something I've always said here. Um, we do not know how to negotiate. We always put the wrong people in the front. This is since we've had our independence as a country, we've never had a good negotiator. We always just put the wrong people in place, and they end up taking advantage of them like a shark in a pond. You know, and the reason why I said this goes back to the famous 68, 66 bogus concession out of the 68 that was signed. When you hear people talk about that, this is not just a statement. This is true. This is fact. And the reason why I said that, out of those 66, I read five of those concessions. And one thing that is a trend that is constant in those contracts and how they were negotiated in terms of how they were structured is always the case. And if you doubt it, just go through them. It's always the case where it's just basic. This is not any complicated issue to say, what, these people just came in and took advantage of what we didn't know. It's blatant, meaning how this is usually done is done through what I call layering, right? They do that in what we call venture capital, right? Where you have a parent company, right? Google does that, the likes of Amazon does that. You have a parent company that is based in another country, but you have a subsidiary that is domestic, meaning in Liberia. But so in those contract, in those concessions, what usually happens is that instead of the government of Liberia going in contract with both the subsidiary that's registered in Liberia and the parent company, they go in uh, agreement with just the subsidiary. But in our contract, what usually happens is that the parent company, the domestic company, the subsidiary that is in Liberia, usually has like a management fee that is paying out to the parent company on every profit that it generates, revenue, not profit, but revenue that it generates in Liberia. So what usually happens, let's say if the company that is now, let's say a mining company that is now doing business in Liberia, let's say they mine 100 million out of iron ore in Liberia in a 12-month period, they will say, what, we're paying 25% management fee to the parent company. So that 25 million goes to the parent company as management fees to their parent company, right? That the government cannot collect taxes on, it cannot collect any kind of royalties on, right? So the only thing that the government of Liberia collects royalties and taxes on are uh, the 75% that is left, which is the 75 million, right? There's a simple structure that you see constant in those documents all the time. It is so obvious and so pervasive and so exploitative that sometimes you will see some company exiting. So whenever you go through this contract, you read about another partner in the deal exiting. That's because they see that loophole that is being exploited, so literally what it means is that you can be in that contract for 50 years, 25 years, you will not recoup enough profit from that because you're being exploited basic through that management fee structure that we do. That's exactly, so the five concessions that I read, that's exactly how they were structured. Sometimes you read it, sometimes you question yourself, who was sitting at this table? Who were these people sitting at this table? The other thing is that the basic thing they give us in terms of, oh, we're going to build this road here, we're going to do this here, we're going to do this for the community here, we're going to pay. Sometimes you have to look at it this way. Are these companies doing that because it gives them the leverage, or are they doing that because um, this is something the government wants them to do, right? perfect example. If an iron ore company is going to Nimba and they say we want to build a road that connects us from Nimba to the Freeport of Monrovia, they're not just doing that because it benefits Liberia. They're doing that because it allows them to easily have a transportation route that gets them to export whatever resources they take out of Nimba, right? So you have to think about these things in totality. So for me, that's what I talk about when I said, you know what, I think they're able to raise that's 2.7 billion through those private sector investments, but you also have to have good negotiators, people who have been still in this kind of processes and understand contract negotiation, understand how agreements work. Putting clauses that protect yourself. Last thing I would say on that is when you're drafting these kind of contract, you do not want to, even if you're going 25 years or 50 years, you do not want to, you want to have what we call review stages, meaning every 5 years you come back to the table to review it. Meaning, is this side of, are we meeting both end of our bargain? Am I meeting my end of the bargain? Is the government meeting its end of the bargain? And if there needs to be a revision, put in a clause in our contract that, if one side there's a what we call covenant that breaks the covenant within those agreements, there got to be a covenant kill provision, meaning you have to do something that will kill that provision that you broke, meaning you violated, right? So this is why you review the contract every 5 years. So I will rest on that. I think this one is a little bit more realistic that they're able to raise out 2.7 billion or 35% of it. The third piece on that is the grant. So the government is expecting 1.9 billion or 25% from grants from different, well, as they always like to refer to, international partners. I think if nothing can tell you about the how you know I don't want to even want to call it idiots, how not stupid, but how not foresighted it is to rely on grant. This current administration here in America should tell you why, right? We are in some a point in our history that we've never been in before, where you have a president and administration comes in that just cuts off every grant to every country, to the point right now there are people on AIDS drugs in different parts of Africa that are funded by aid, right? That cannot get their drugs. That if this continue for the next 6 months or so, you could have implication that is far reaching across the continent, because these people take drugs and these drugs are funded by a donors fund, right? And if we're at this place where the donors funds are now cut off and this continue for a long period of time, you'll have people that cannot take their medications anymore. And that means their exposure level goes high, and people will be people, and you could see the AIDS epidemic continue to pick up again in our country. So that's just one aspect of the 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 disadvantage of relying on aid for any agenda. And in our case, we as we're projecting that 1.9 billion of it, which is 25%, will be coming from aid. you know what happened if you don't get that money from the aid? What happened if the country itself is going through its economic challenges and cannot fund you some of this money? And you can, to their case, they can say, hey, we're not getting that from one country. We're getting it from different international partner. True, which is right. However, the point here is that you do not rely, at least not that percentage of it, not 25%. I think is a lot to allocate, that you're going to be getting from a partner. Just grant, which is good. It's free money. If you can find it, take it. But I don't think there's anything as free lunch. So you can take whatever you want to do with that. The last piece here, before I yield and wrap up, is the diaspora piece of it. So we send home in the diaspora, like old man used to tell me, He always like to say that we're the middle class of Liberia, and I agree with him. The 16 county of Liberia, we're the middle class of Liberia because there's no middle class in Liberia. You're either up there or you're all the way at the totem pole, right at the bottom of the totem pole, right? And he said we're the middle class of Liberia, and I agree with him. And in that case, we do send home 800 million annually. I think last year we did. So that is, expected to grow every year. Um, based on the, you know, again, economic uh, conditions here. And the government is saying that, 700 million of that, which is of their aid agenda, which is 10%, will be coming from the diaspora. Again, which is true, but that money does not go collectively into a bucket to say, okay, it comes into this bucket and the government is going to do A, B, C, and D with it. It goes to various projects, meaning I'm sending, uh, you know, 100,000 to build a house or 150 to start a fund or whatever it is, or whatever you to do a project, to start a business, to even pay people school fees and all of that, right? So it's not going into a bucket to say you can allocate it into a pool, and then you can take that pool of money and now invest it into other things or do carry out some of the things into the economic um, aid agenda that you plan out. So this is, again, this is, I don't I think this is probably an aspirational aspect of it because they are not going, they don't have control over this aspect of it. The fund that we send back home, they have no control over it, right? We do as a people. Now, in terms of the economic impact that 800 million that we send home has on the economy, if they can quantify it and put that somewhere in the budget, and I mean in the agenda to say, based on the 800 million, this is how much economic activity, you would think that, from a qualitative and quantitative standpoint, this is how much it does to the economy. Then I would say yes, you can take account to that. You can say, okay, over the next 5 years or so, this is how much that will actually contribute to the economy. This is how many jobs that will create. Then we can, you know, say, okay, that's a little bit more realistic, but you cannot just put that into the budget just because it's going there. You have no control over that aspect of the funding. So that's I thought that being in there was, it was a little bit of a stretch. But again, that's government. Sometimes they do things you don't understand. It's kind of just confusing. And as I said, throughout this series that we're going to be doing here, we're going to be reaching out to people in the government that are a part of this plan to come and talk about these things. Hopefully, they're able to, articulate um, in bite sizes what that 300-page document means, and we can have a conversation about it and really put some sense to uh, those pillars, projections, and everything else that it includes. But for me, as I always say, I will close on this, is that we are in a stage, in an age where you you don't rely on presentation anymore. Meaning, before you used to see people having their company, they're going to investors to pitch on PowerPoints. That is great. You do that, they will ask you questions, and if you're good at articulating your point, you will get the funding. But we have moved away from that. We're no longer in that presentation piece anymore where you can just put things on paper and just come in and blabber to, because everybody can talk, right? What people look for is, one, the team that you have on your company or in your group or organization. Two, how good at executing that team is in terms of your plans or whatever plans you have, how good of a executing, how good that team can execute or that group can execute. And three, which is goes to the first thing that I said, implementation, meaning um, how good are they good at solving problem. And I say this because let's say this was a government that's pitching to all of us, which is this what this plan is, right? They put this thing in a 300-page, they presented this to us. Some of us are still biting through it, trying to figure out uh, the reality from the aspirational piece and see how we can marry the two. But at the same time, we are also looking at the team that is that just put out this paper, right? Meaning we're not just looking at what they're selling us, but we're looking at how good can they execute, right? That's one. Two, what have they done that can prove that this group, if we are even if they're able to raise that 8.4 billion, that they're able to execute, and we will see the fruits of that 8.4 billion in the next 5, 6, 7, 10 years, or 20 years, or 15 years or so, right? So from an investor standpoint, this is the lens that which I'm looking at is the two most important thing: the team, I mean the current administration ability to execute. Two, the implementation aspect of it, right? What have you done that shows me that if I invest in this, you will be able to do the same thing. And two, most importantly, the team that is around you. You know, as I always says in the investment world, you can come to me as a good with a good idea, good product or service. If your team cannot execute, they cannot implement, it's just a waste of time. Why? Because I can take that same plan and give it to another team that is good at executing and implementing, and they will do a far better job than you, and they will put you out of business. The same thing goes for this plan here. This is a plan that we're being pitched, that we're being told in terms of the funding, what they're going to do and whatnot. But what we're looking at is two, the implementation and the team that is looking to implement. So from what we have seen so far over the last 12 months, that is no indication of it. So again, we'll want to be fair here. So we will take the series here throughout the series to unpack, to peel back the onion, and really make sure we cover every basis on here. So that is my thoughts. And as I said, it's going to be an ongoing series, and we look forward to having all of you here as we navigate through all of this. Um, um, Thank you for joining for this very short uh, discussion. Hopefully, we can see you throughout the series. Um, and as we always like to say, as you go through this piece of document, please have your questions. And as you come on the show to watch how we talk about it, ask your question, bring perspective. I love perspective. You know, the way we could be looking at things could be different from how somebody else is looking at it, right? Because you're looking at it from a different lens. It is also good to communicate those perspective as well. So whoever or everybody else can look at things from your perspective, and they can see it from an angle that, you know, they weren't looking at. So again, this is why I love perspective, not just question, but bring your perspective as well as we navigate through this. So without further ado, I think that brings us to the end of this discussion. And on that note, we will see you next Saturday. Again, I'm excited about this plan. I think we're all excited about Liberia in terms of what we can do to finally put this country back in terms of what you like to call it, my Oma like to call it normal days, right? Um, and really, if not the normal days, at least put us on a trajectory that the young people in our country can be excited about. And at least when they're talking about Liberia, you can raise your head up high and say, hey, we're not there yet, but at least we're on the right path. So that's what we hope this plan can do, and this is why we want to talk about it. And we will see you next Saturday. Adios.
We all love you.